Good evening, and welcome to episode 41 of the Political Mike podcast. A popular New York governor with a national brand resigns amid claims of sexual misconduct, and a little known name from upstate New York is set to take his place. The Senate exhibits something it hasn't in a long time: bipartisanship, with the passage of an expansive infrastructure bill. The United Nations Climate Panel report conveys a stark reality pertaining to global warming, and a defiant GOP senator blocks President Biden's State Department nominees from being confirmed amid the backdrop of the Taliban rapidly seizing control over major cities in Afghanistan. Here to help me break it all down are distinguished and very inquisitive minds. None of them are guests to the Political Mic. Each of them have been here before and have always contributed a wealth of knowledge, and it is my privilege at this time to introduce them to you again. Again, we have Ms. Cassandra Knopf, who graduated from the University of Kansas in 2016, earning a bachelor's in English and Korean before pursuing a legal education at Howard University School of Law. She also recently graduated, like I mentioned, but while at Howard University School of Law, she worked in the office of Kansas Representative Sharice Davids, where she became intimately familiar with the legislative process of Capitol Hill. She also worked for the nonprofit organization, the Chesapeake Legal Alliance, regarding clean water issues in the region. She then worked for the United States Environmental Protection Agency, and this past spring semester, she was working as an intern for the Environmental Defense Fund regarding clean air and clean energy issues. Cassandra, thanks so much for being back.
Thank you for having me here.
Next, we have Mr. Zach Tolan, who is now a third-year Juris Doctorate candidate at Howard University School of Law with an eye towards public interest law and public criminal defense in particular. He was born and raised in Allentown, Pennsylvania. He spent much of his youth pursuing opportunities to discuss political, social justice, and moral and philosophical issues. Upon graduating from high school, he was awarded the National Society of the Sons of the American Revolution. He attended the George Washington University, where he earned a Bachelor's of Arts, majoring in history and minoring in creative writing and political science, and was inducted into the Phi Beta Kappa Society. Since beginning Howard Law, Zach had the opportunity to intern at multiple nonprofit interest organizations, including American Atheists, a group dedicated to upholding Thomas Jefferson's vision of a wall of separation between church and state guaranteed by the First Amendment, and Environmental Defense Fund. Zach, it's a privilege and honor to have you here.
Thank you for having me back.
Next, we have Chris Johnson, a good friend of mine. Chris is actually a proud native of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. He's an alumnus of Oakwood University, my alma mater, where he earned a Bachelor's of Arts degree in pre-law with a concentration in political science. He recently served as the District Office Chief of Staff for Pennsylvania State Representative Joanna McClinton. He is now a staffer for Pennsylvania Democratic Senator Bob Casey. Previously, he served as a Capitol Hill intern with the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation in Washington, D.C. And he interned with the 2016 Democratic National Convention Committee in Philadelphia. He's also a former field organizer for Hillary Clinton's 2016 presidential campaign. Chris, privilege and honor to have you back, sir. The experiences he has, man, I'm just envious. And then last but not least, Professor Fred Cook, who was born and raised in the District of Columbia. He attended the DC public schools, graduated from McClinley Technical High School in 1965. Mr. Cook deferred some of his U.S. Air Force service and enrolled at Howard University School of Law, where he was a managing editor of the Howard Law Journal and chairman of the National Conference of Law Reviews for the 1971 to 72 school year. In 77, he returned to D.C. and began a law practice with a large corporate law firm specializing in telecommunications, higher education, entertainment, and corporate law. He has been an adjunct faculty member since 1992. He's one of the founding members of the Black Entertainment and Sports Lawyers Association, a member of the Washington Bar Association Hall of Fame, and a Washington Magazine top lawyer. Such a distinguished panel. It was always a privilege to have each of you back here. It's hard to believe it's been 41 episodes, but here we are. So much to discuss. And I just want to dive right into it. in the wake of New York Governor Andrew Cuomo's resignation, there are a lot of questions that have still seemed to be up in the air. One is, his replacement. How will she get along with the Democrats in New York up there? Will she side more with the moderate Democrats, the liberal Democrats? Will she continue the legacy of Cuomo? Now, of course, Cuomo leaves with an impressive progressive legacy. You're talking about gun control, environmental justice. He's really checked off a lot of boxes the Democrats nationally like to see. But we see, that this popular brand name, the Cuomo brand name, is now stepping out of the limelight. He reached new political heights, of course, with the news briefings that captured the nation's attention in the midst of this pandemic and before we even had a vaccine. He served. He was elected to 3 terms. And his resignation comes just 1 week after Attorney General Tish James releases a bombshell report that gave credence to the allegations of sexual misconduct. Now, I want to open up the floor by asking, could Governor Cuomo have remained in the governorship position any longer with this investigation's findings over his head? And I asked that in light of the fact that, remember Ralph Northam in 2019, everyone thought his political future was done when revelations came out against him wearing blackface, I believe, in an event. Now he's still in the governorship. Of course, he's not running again. I believe he's restricted, but it seemed as if the attention faded away from that fairly quickly. Could Governor Cuomo have made the same decision to stay and wait it out?
Probably not. I think, part of what Cuomo's problem was that he didn't have much in the way of support among people generally. He wasn't a particularly well-liked guy. He wasn't a particularly well-regarded guy. He was mostly feared than liked. The allegations were pretty blunt, hard to nuance. Governor Northam in Virginia, the allegations were, in his distant past, they were a little squishy in terms of was it really him? Because he first said it was, then he said it wasn't. He's a well-liked guy. He had a reputation of being on the progressive end of politics in the state of Virginia, certainly. And people genuinely liked him. And I think that is what got him the time to sort of ride out the negative that of first impression, and he was able to survive. Cuomo, on the other hand, didn't have any of those things going for him. The revelations were both old and new. They were pretty gross in terms of what they were made to be. And he didn't have much goodwill from people who thought, well, he's really a nice guy and maybe made a mistake. They thought he was a jackass and a bully, and they were happy to see him go. So I just don't think he never. I think once that report came out that was issued by a Howard Law School alum, then I just think he was done. And it was just a matter of time as to whether he walked out or whether he was pushed out.
Go ahead, Zach.
I was just going to say I 100% agree, particularly with Northam. It was, I think, one photo in a medical school yearbook from maybe 50 years before. Cuomo was still doing everything he was accused of by his own admission up until the day that the report came out. I think if anyone saw that video, his explanation, he said, "I'm not a pervert, I'm Italian." And that he was, he was not really apologizing for it. He was giving the excuse of, for me, it's acceptable to grab someone by the face and kiss them, whether or not they want me to do that. So I don't think he played it in any way, apart from just being what seemed to be a very unlikable man. He didn't even try to play it well when the news started blowing up about what he'd been doing, and sort of his chickens came home to roost.
Yeah.
And the explanation. Oh, Chris, go ahead.
If I could just add really quickly, as everyone was saying, the governor did a lot of
bad and wrong in his past and even in recent times. But I think he did the right thing by stepping away. But it was also probably the only thing he could do politically. You're thinking about this, where we are in terms of, we have a state that just received a windfall of money in terms of stimulus dollars that came from the federal government, and is in the middle of trying to disperse those dollars to communities that need them. We're also seeing just a resurgence of the Delta variant and all the challenges that is bringing down, will continue to bring. And so we don't need no state needs a governor who has these allegations hanging over them. Also, just the reality of impeachment that was looming and may continue to loom even beyond the last 2 weeks that he'll be serving in his term. And so I do think that it was for the best of New Yorkers for him to step aside and to allow for Katie Hochul, who has been the lieutenant governor for, I think, 9 years now, or as long as Cuomo has been seated at the top of the governorship, who has a great deal of experience. He's from Buffalo, New York, upstate New York, but also has a wealth of experience governing. So we're interested in seeing how she's going to, carry that great state forward.
Now, what was interesting in the explanation was that it seemed he said that the goalpost has been moved. Now, the thing is, and I've heard the point made before, in the wake of the Me Too movement, we have a lot of allegations that date back to 30 plus years ago, 20 years ago, 10 years ago. But in this situation, you have a governor who Zach pointed out, by his admission, did this in the aftermath, in the wake of the Me Too movement, and looking at the repercussions of what happens when these allegations are made, and an investigation can back it up. But I want to pivot a little bit to the political side of this. This of course takes away any kind of potential straw man that the GOP could have used in New York House races, and in the governorship race. Because now that Cuomo's gone, you have now a new, completely clean slate with this new incoming governor, Kathy Hochul, who will be the nation's 57th governor, the first female governor. But the question still, looms for me. The widespread calls for Cuomo to step down, does that actually provide an opening for New York Republicans, who are seeking to take back the governorship? Now, remember, the New York Republicans haven't had the governorship, I think, since Pataki was elected in 2002. It's been a while. New York is a solidly blue state. But, looking at House races up and down the ballot, will there be a down ballot effect?
I have that concern because this isn't exactly Cuomo's first scandal either. There was that report that came out that they were hiding numbers of nursing home fatalities from COVID. And that was in the wake of him being hailed as sort of a hero based on how he handled COVID. And he was being looked at as sort of one of the few sane governors taking leadership when Trump had abdicated for responsibility for the pandemic. So I think that there's a couple levels of betrayal felt within maybe the Democratic community, which would be warranted. Now, I don't necessarily think that that's a good reason to potentially see that political ground, especially right now, since the GOP is very unstable, and I feel that they have a tendency towards extremism at the moment. But I do feel like that did leave an opening, and I do see that as concerning. I don't know. I think that New York itself is not easily convinced by Republican talking points, so that might be a blessing, but that doesn't necessarily guarantee anything. I would like to hear from Professor Cook about this, actually.
Wait a minute. This is not back in class. I think that New York is an interesting state in the sense that they have a long and recent history of corruption of their senior elected officials. Governors, lieutenant governors have been corrupt and have been pushed out of office because of bad conduct. New York City the largest, obviously, city in the state, has elected Republican mayors in the not too distant past. And in fact, the current successor to the New York's mayor is functionally a Republican, although he calls himself a Democrat. So I think that New York politics is really kind of odd, and I think it's very imaginable for a Republican to be elected statewide in a governorship in New York, not just because of Cuomo's missteps, not just because of Cuomo's bad behavior, but because New Yorkers seem to be okay with Republicans, the kind of Republicans, at least, that get elected in New York. The kind of Republicans that get elected in New York are not the same kind of Republicans that get elected in Alabama or Mississippi. But I think they could. Probably won't, but I think they could.
I saw, a comment in the, comment box, and I had the same point. When it comes down to these kinds of allegations, especially during the Me Too movement, the Democrats seem to take more of a moral high ground than the Republicans on this. Remember, you had Republicans saying that Roy Moore needs to drop out the race and that he should not be elected to the Senate in 2017. But that was after how many claims upon claims upon claims, until it just became ridiculous, where there was no other way to go. But you look at Al Franken and you see how the swiftness with which the Democrats moved to unite behind ousting him for something that, was, as a comedian, you can always, that aside, let me rephrase it this way. It seemed as if the Republicans always seemed to get away with not being as strict or as, being as ready to denounce one of their own solely for political reasons. And I've heard people say that this was just a political process. This was politics all around. What do you make of those perspectives and criticisms?
Personally, I think there's something to it. With Cuomo, I think it's a little bit different in that it was pretty egregious. He was still actively doing it, and he was also very unpopular. Cassandra mentioned even the secret nursing home deaths that he had hit. Like, there was a lot of stuff going on to very much justify a wide-ranging group of people saying, "Can we please get him out of office? Leave. You need to go." I think Franken was the most egregious example of potentially an overreaction, but it was number one at the height of the Me Too movement, and also I believe it was 2017 that the calls for him were to step down, maybe 2018. But so it was not only at the height of the Me Too movement, but it was also while the Democratic Party was trying to define itself in the wake and in opposition to President Trump. And at that time, I think a lot of Democrats, especially and particularly establishment Democrats who were trying to figure out how do we define ourselves differently, were trying to latch on to anything to appear as the moral party, because the Republican Party does like to make that argument a lot of the time, that it's the moral party, the American party. Whether or not you necessarily agree with that, whether or not I necessarily agree with that is different. But there's a large section of a group of people who hear those arguments. Who's the moral party? We're claiming to be the moral party, and if you as the moral party aren't willing to condemn your own members for doing things that you were trying to condemn the person who was just elected president for, that Billy Bush interview with the president, if people weren't going to jump down Senator Franken's throat, it was going to look really bad for all of those, particularly establishment Democrats who were trying to define themselves and their party as the moral party. So I think that had a lot to do with the very quick jump to ask Franken to resign for something that did happen 30 years earlier. And I don't believe there was any evidence of really a pattern of that kind of thing happening. Not to make an excuse for what he had done, which was not acceptable, but I think that was different from what happened with Cuomo by quite a margin.
Just to add, I don't think that it's a problem to, as a party, to maintain a moral high ground on issues related to, sexual misconduct, sexual harassment, particularly in this moment. But I also think that we can't forget how political parties can be strategic in a lot of their decisions. If you imagine, even with Al Franken, he was a senator in a largely blue state that had a Democratic governor who could replace him with another Democratic senator who would likely be someone who could be reelected, versus, if it had been a different Democratic senator or governor, and particularly not the bluest state, or you know what I mean? Like, I wonder if their calculations around calling this person to resign or to be shipped away would be different. And perhaps it might. I'm not sure if that's the right thing, but I also think that we shouldn't negate or discount just the calculation that some of these parties will carry when they make these decisions.
Why aren't the Democrats, making this point, hitting it home, saying, "Look, we're taking the moral high ground on this." If this is for political, outlooks and everything like that, why not bring the case home to the folks who are up in arms about this? Why not draw the lines for the people and say, "Look, we have a track record of actually standing up for women who are victims of sexual assault. We have a track record of calling for powerful folks to step down when they are the center of at the center of allegations." What is this hesitancy on the Democratic side? Therefore, and someone made the point. At least make the connection. The Republicans don't even call out the folks who tried to hang them on January the 6th. By not even going through to have a legitimate Senate hearing about what was, to find out what was behind this domestic terrorist event. What say you?
Well, I don't think it's very politically useful to say we're the party that wants to behave appropriately. It doesn't get you any points for saying I'm doing what I'm supposed to do. That's not a particularly useful political slogan. When you stand up for decency, when you stand up for appropriate behavior, when you stand up against people discriminating against people because of their race, religion, gender, when you don't allow bullying, it's not really attractive as a political campaign trope to say I'm a good guy. I'm for the right thing. So I think that's part of why the Democrats don't tout it as a campaign platform piece. They'd rather see themselves as talking about the so-called bread and butter issues, the current foreign relations issues, as the thing that distinguishes them from the so-called Republicans. I mean, Mr. Moore, lost by less than a percentage point difference in the vote in Alabama. Okay, Roy Moore, there was still a whole bunch of Republicans who said, yeah, we either heard that and we don't care, or we heard it and we don't believe it, and we're going to vote for Roy anyway. So, I think to speak to Mr. Johnson's point about strategic thought, Republicans as a group, and obviously a great gross overgeneralization, are much more strategic about how does this help us win? How does this help us keep power? How does this help us move our agenda forward, as opposed to anything else? Which in part explains a guy like Donald Trump. It's like it's got. We don't care about his peccadillos, his fleas. If he can be president, we can get enough of what we want out of him that we'll live with the other stuff. And on the Democrat side, thankfully, from my view, that's not as prevalent a thought. Although I'm old enough to remember, and you guys aren't, William Jefferson Clinton, who the Democrats held their nose and said, he's our boy, we're going with him, even though by today's standard, they'd have frog marched him out of the building.
I do want to ask about, before we move on from this segment, Hochul is going to be the first female governor of New York in a few days. Now, she had made in her comments yesterday, she made the remark that no one would accuse my administration of being a toxic work environment. So we already see she's working to distance herself from what will be her predecessor, Andrew Cuomo. She also admitted that, look, we have not been close. She acknowledged that she was never in Cuomo's inner circle. She claimed it's no secret that we have not been close. That being said, would progressive Democrats, now remember, this is New York, like Cassandra pointed out, we're talking about Queens, we're talking about the Bronx, we're talking about Brooklyn. You're talking about folks like the gentleman who won the primaries for the mayor race. His name escapes me right now. Eric, can't remember the last name, but Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez as well. Will these folks get in line with the new governor, or would she be at odds with more far left members of her party?
I mean, I certainly think it's quite possible that she might be at odds with some of the more far left members. That tends to happen when you have this two-party system where we have the left and the right, and 3 million people in the middle of some kind of spectrum. I mean, the other thing is that, I think most of the people you mentioned are from sort of New York City. And New York is also Schenectady and Albany and Buffalo and every other smaller town that unfortunately I don't know the name of. So, she will need to be governor for the entire state, which does require representing some of the more conservative opinions within the state. And she is also the state governor, so she'll be focused on state issues, whereas someone like Ocasio-Cortez is very much a national issue person. Not that there isn't overlap, but when Ocasio-Cortez is focusing on national Green New Deals and national healthcare and national security, Hochul will be. Probably a degree of overlap, but her main concern is what is best for the state of New York. So there's also going to be some friction there. But I don't know. It's certainly not the Republican Party where you have, Republican royalty, Liz Cheney being kicked out of leadership because she wouldn't because she was willing to think that the insurrection was a problem. I don't think there's going to be quite that level of division within the party, even in New York.
Do you think they'll primary her next year? Say she decides to run in her right next year, 2022, which most likely will happen. Will they have a candidate of their own from the far left primarying her? The same way Cynthia Nixon came at Andrew Cuomo, I believe, in 2018.
Well, I hope if they do, that's someone who's more qualified than television star for sorry, it wasn't television, it was HBO. But I hope that if they do, it's someone more qualified. But I'll be perfectly honest, I'm not all that familiar with internal New York state politics, but I imagine certainly at the primary level, someone's going to want to run against her. She wasn't elected to the governorship, so if she does run again, someone will probably think, maybe I have a shot at becoming governor of New York. That there's some benefits to that, so I might as well try. Whether or not that gets a lot of traction, who knows? But
the New York governorship. I was going to say the New York governorship includes a lot of executive power. It's a major seat in a major state in the country, and so I think while Kathy Hochul has a really big job in making sure that she can continue to steer this ship while she leads it. While I also, Zach, am not a, an political insider in New York State politics, I would imagine that there will be a number of folks who decide to, put their name in the hat and run in the Democratic primary, which will begin, I believe, is it next year or 2023? Is the election year. So I will keep an eye on that. Yeah, 22. So, yeah.
Professor Cook, you were going to say something?
Well, I got to get out of mute. Yeah. I was going to say I agree with Mr. Tolan. I think New York politics are kind of weird. Ms. Hochul isn't a political force in New York. I mean, and that's not to knock her. It's just the way the lieutenant governorship works in New York is that you really don't have this broad base of support necessarily. You have to go out and make it. And Mr. Cuomo didn't give her much oxygen to breathe in order to create her own political apparatus within the Democrat Party in New York State. So she's likely to get competition. But as Mr. Tolan said, New York is more than New York City. And while you have that sort of progressive attitude extant in New York City, when you go to Utica, when you go to Rochester, when you go to Albany, when you go to Buffalo, when you go to Schenectady, it's a whole different deal. And that progressive agenda is not as central to the thought process of people. I think they tend to skew more blue than red, but it's not as blue as AOC or some of the members of Congress, certainly from New York in the Democrat Party. So I think she should expect competition, and she may get whacked because New York is strange. I mean, there'll be deals made and people promised all kinds of things for their own political benefit in New York State. And the theory is, can she deliver on those promises better than somebody else? So that may be the reason she gets dumped, not because of any real fault of her, is just that she's not as good a deal maker as somebody else might be.
Yeah, and she's coming into the cockpit, the pilot seat during a lot of turbulence. You've got the Delta variant, as Chris mentioned. You have the situation where folks are trying to ensure that there are uniform standards for schools to abide by. There's a lot going on at one time that she's stepping into. So it's going to be interesting to see how she plays, how she conducts herself as the governor, and whether or not people respond favorably to it. But I do want to pivot to the bipartisan infrastructure bill the Senate passed this past Tuesday. After months of fractions of negotiations among lawmakers in the White House, the path ahead still looks to be tortuous because now Democrats have to keep their own party in line as they attempt to move the infrastructure bill forward to the House, where it will eventually be paired with a $3.5 trillion budget reconciliation package loaded with the party's climate, health, and social priorities. And because of the way reconciliation works, of course, we do know that reconciliation is a very specific budget process because when you're reconciling, you're really reconciling figures and dollars together. And when you do that, you can use a loophole in the process that allows you to pass something with just 50 votes and not 60. So you kind of think of reconciliation in the Senate more of a sort of fast track way of getting things done. But they will need every Democratic senator's support for this to work. Now, what's interesting is that Pelosi had already mentioned it and said, look, we're not going to go forward with this infrastructure bill if the Senate Democrats don't get in line with this reconciliation package. In my view, of course, Chris Matthews was on last week and he expressed his opposition to that take that House Speaker Pelosi has made. But I want to get your perspectives. Was it politically wise for House Speaker Pelosi to oppose bringing the infrastructure bill to the floor until the Senate also passes this reconciliation bill?
Who knows? I mean, the problem is this. Politically wise, yes, in the sense of in the building, among the House of Representatives, among the Democrat caucus, that was a position she almost had to take in order to keep her caucus together, to keep them from fracturing before they even had anything substantively to consider. Because if she had said that we will do this and then we'll do that whenever we get it, she would have lost the so-called progressives who think and continue to believe that tying them together is the only way to get what they want or what they think they need. So in that sense, yeah, it made good political sense. On a more pragmatic and outside the Democrat caucus, it really maybe wasn't all that good an idea, because it gave Mitch McConnell and the so-called Republicans in the Senate a roadmap as to how to defeat the whole proposition. Because once he was told that they're tied together forever, he could say to his caucus, well, all they're doing is hustling you. They're getting you to vote for this so-called infrastructure bill and to talk about it being bipartisan, when all they're doing is laying in the weeds to do this other thing on the other side. So why should we give them that to get this? Now, ultimately, Mitch McConnell voted for the infrastructure bill, but Mitch McConnell also told them right after they voted for it, that reconciliation piece is not happening now. It's not happening tomorrow. It's not happening next week. It's not happening. And that's because he knows that there are at least 2 and probably 7 Democrats who are never going to vote for it at $3.5 trillion. Now, there may be a number less than that you can get most of them on, but you may not be able to get Joe Manchin under any set of circumstances if a Republican doesn't join.
No, those are awesome points, because one of the things I was considering is, how amazing it is that McConnell even said yes to this. Remember, this is, of course, this is the skinny version of what the Democrats initially wanted, which included what they term as human infrastructure. Now we're solely dealing with roads, bridges. Now we're even including broadband into the definition of infrastructure. We're including internet. Now, the fact that Pelosi is taking this hardline position on this, is that going to cost Democrats when they want to tout their support for this? I mean, when they want to use this in their war chest when it's time to campaign again and say, look, this is what I bought for you. Is this going to damage their, especially House members who run every 2 years? Is this going to damage, their standing on this issue?
Well, I think that it's interesting to see. First, I think that it's great that the Senate was able to, over the last few months, come to a conclusion, come to a deal to pass the bipartisan infrastructure deal, which will improve America's roads, bridges, highways, invest in fiber so that we can have stronger broadband, both in rural communities, ex-urban communities, suburban communities, and in parts of the urban community like Philadelphia, where just this past school year, kids were having to wait outside of a McDonald's parking lot or of another like building's parking lot just to get Wi-Fi, just to kind of steal some Wi-Fi from that area. So that's the kind of that's a picture, a window into the sort of like infrastructure crisis that we've been dealing with. And we all drive roads, we all drive highways, we all know the need that is there. So I'm first glad that the Senate Democrats and Republicans were able to come to a deal. I think it's also interesting just to see, if we're talking about politics, on one end you have the moderates, on both sides of the aisle in the Senate, say, hey, listen, this is what we're fighting with. These are the conversations that we're going to have. This infrastructure package is going to run through us. But it's also interesting to see just in the House side, where you have a strong and growing progressive caucus also say, like, well, if Senator Manchin wants to use his leverage in the Senate, we also have power. We also have votes. We all have an opportunity to show our leverage here in the House. And I think when you see Speaker Pelosi making the decision saying, listen, we have a consensus where we have to tie these 2-track agenda items together, which also is what President Biden is saying. It is also an opportunity for progressive Democrats to show their sort of leverage as well and kind of flex their muscles. But I also think the reason why they're fighting for it is to say, listen, yes, we're going to improve our roads, we're going to improve our bridges, we're going to improve our highways, but also where are we going to, like, what about the state of the places in which we are using those bridges to arrive to? How about the schools that we're sending our kids to? How about the congregate care facilities that we're going to have our elderly and our minority women workers working in, more often than normal? How are we improving the conditions of childcare and making that more affordable? This is also an opportunity for us to have investments in dental and vision and other parts of healthcare that can be included in Medicare. So like, I think just as important as it is to, having strong investments in our roads and bridges, we have people who need help as well. And, I think it's important for us to kind of tie these two things together, because if we don't now, I don't think that we'll ever have an opportunity for us to allow for dental and vision to be included in healthcare, or, be able to make the investments that are really needed in order to combat climate change, which is not really included as heavily as needed in the bipartisan infrastructure deal. So that's why it's important for us to kind of tie these two track agendas together, because they do kind of overall help they improve the health of the entire country, both in terms of people, but also in terms of capital infrastructure as well.
I'm really happy, I'm really happy that Chris brought up climate change, because I think that was a really important thing. Both because of the fact that we just saw that UN report, but also because I think it was the 1950s or 60s was the last time the United States truly invested in its infrastructure. So we have like electrical and road infrastructure that is really like completely overstretched for what it was designed for, which means that we're losing a lot of money in repairs, on outdated technology, on things that so we're really just siphoning money off to interests that don't actually end up benefiting us in terms of the utility itself. So like, not only is this overhaul going to hopefully make us more efficient as a country so that the consumer pays less, but also it'll make it hopefully that we contribute less to the climate change that we as a country are unfortunately very responsible for. We consume a lot of fossil fuels and produce a lot of methane based on our consuming habits and what we produce. So I agree. I don't think this bipartisan bill does enough to address that. I don't think that it integrates enough of the Paris agreements and what hopefully we're going to have revised Paris agreements. But even then, that'll be even more aggressive than what we have. I am not 100% hopeful that the Congress we have will be able to do that. But it is the number one concern among young people in this country right now. And that in itself means that it will or is already a political force. How that will play out, I'm not sure.
And to your point, what do you say to the Democrats who are more on the center side, like Manchin and Sinema, who seem to have a problem with the price tag behind this? You're looking at, for instance, the PBS NewsHour reported yesterday the national debt right now is at 22.3 trillion, and if you were to pass this infrastructure bill, you're talking about adding somewhere between 250 and 400 billion, depending on how you calculate it, and then you have to add that to the reconciliation bill, which is 1.75 trillion. What is your response to them and say, and before you jump there, I do want to throw out some food for thought. The fact that Republicans didn't seem to be worried about deficits at all when it came down to the border wall. No amount was too high when it came down to that, it seemed. Because, of course, we were using that as a bartering chip when it came down to immigration reform. But I want to get your thoughts on that.
Well, I believe that the price tag isn't the only thing you should look at when you're investing. If I was going to buy a space shuttle, I would expect to invest several $billions in it, versus if I was going to buy, my first vehicle, which will get me from point A to point B. And what we are asking for right now is a complete overhaul of our system, because it's not working and it's actively like breaking down. It's obvious that it's going to cost an insane amount of money, but we're investing in something that will hopefully pay for itself back in terms of health, in terms of actual economic benefit, in terms of creating the jobs so that we will have hopefully a growth in the population that is considered middle class, and hopefully shrinkage in what we consider the poverty class. There's been a gigantic wealth divide that's only becoming larger. So I think that what we're looking at is this infrastructure bill is the center of, or the nexus of, a potential for hope that will solve several social solutions or social problems at once. And I feel that the Sinema and Manchin I call them conservative Democrats. I don't think that they can really be considered central at this point, because it seems very blinders on type approach to something like this.
I mean, you also have to consider just the price tag of what will happen and what has happened if we don't invest in our infrastructure, if we don't put investments to make sure that we can stem the tide of climate change, which has already arrived, right? The climate crisis is already here. We've already seen the wildfires that have been spreading all across the West, and we've seen the smoke that is, swept all across the country and even reached parts of Philadelphia in the East Coast. We've seen the storms, we've seen the damages that have from the tornadoes and hurricanes that have eclipsed different parts of the Southern Belt and those parts of the region. And that costs a lot. It costs FEMA, it costs the federal government a lot in order to repair these significant damages. It has a human cost of people having to be displaced. And if we don't make an investment now, that price tag will only increase. So just as Cassandra was saying, it does cost to have some sort of insurance or security for your country and for your future and for the Earth, for planet Earth. And if we don't do it now, particularly in this moment where we have we have the presidency, we have the White House. I mean, with the White House, we have the Senate and the House of Representatives, and which can change in 2 years. We don't know when that next opportunity will come, and so this is the moment in order for us to invest in the future. And I think we have to meet this moment with much might and strength as possible.
Yeah, but why isn't that happening? Okay, you pretty rationally present why it ought to happen, just like Ms. Knopf did. But why isn't that the sentiment among a significant majority of the Congress of the United States? And I would answer the question by saying that part of the reason that is because you really have two fundamental different ideas or views of what government's supposed to do between the so-called Democrats and the so-called Republicans. And even within the so-called Democrat group, there's a different view about what government's role is and what government should be about. The praise that people have given the Congress, the Senate, for bipartisanship in producing this infrastructure bill, in my view, is totally misguided, because it's their friggin' jobs. They shouldn't get any credit for this. If you show up every day to come to work, you don't get a donut for that. That's your job. They're supposed to do this, and they have passed highway bills every year since Eisenhower. So to give them kudos for doing their jobs is kind of silly, and it's part of the hustle that the Republicans would like you to think, that they are being cooperative, they are being bipartisan, they are doing government. When Ms. Knopf talks about when changing the vision of this country, when changing how this country behaves, is not what many of the Republicans and a lot of Democrats are about at all. They don't want that new vision. They don't want to recalibrate how we interact with our environment. They don't want to recalibrate how we define what human infrastructure is. That's not what they believe government is there for. And most of them don't have a governing philosophy about what they want to do with government, except to cut taxes for very rich people, so very rich people can do what very rich people do. And if that has a kind of coincidental benefit to the masses, great. If it just puts money in the rich person's pocket, that's cool too. But they don't think that it's government's job to make it possible for working families to have childcare, to have health care, so they can go to work every day, take care of their families, contribute to the economy, and kind of do this high tide raises all boats kind of philosophy that they say, but they don't believe. So I think the challenge is not that bright young people like yourselves don't see what the future should be and want to try to get there. The question is, how long before the Neanderthal mentality dies out and you can begin to implement your vision? Because they're going to fight you tooth and nail. They're going to resist it every day of the week. And people your age who think like these ossified people too. So it's not just Mitch McConnell. We can't just wait for Mitch McConnell to die. There are younger versions of Mitch McConnell who believe the same stuff and are going to make it difficult for your vision to come to reality, to come to fruition. And that's not to say you should stop. It's just to recognize that this isn't going to be easy by any stretch of the imagination. Change is always difficult. Change is seldom rapid. And you just have to be prepared to have a fight every day for the rest of your natural life, because people are not going to concede this to you.
And to that point, Professor, the Center for American Progress is actually pressing Democratic lawmakers right now to keep the $3.5 trillion reconciliation package as close to its original blueprint, because they argue that it's vital for helping women workers hit hard by the pandemic. Their argument is that if you only pass the infrastructure bill, you're only going to have women bearing a terrible brunt of the economic hardship that has become the reality in the aftermath of this pandemic. So they say that simply passing an infrastructure bill would actually create a massive divergence in the economic recovery along gender lines. Is this finding enough to really push folks? Because, to your point, you do have people celebrating. You have Senator Kyrsten Sinema touting this as a victory lap. I mean, sorry, she's saying, how many times have we heard in recent months that bipartisanship isn't possible anymore? Biden himself said, he made comments and said that any kind of notion that bipartisanship is a relic of a past age is wrong. And after years and years of infrastructure week, we're on the cusp of an infrastructure decade. And of course, that's kind of like sticking it and twisting it for Trump. Senator Rob Portman of Ohio says, who's one of the main architects of this bill. Remember, a gang came together to formulate this bill and make concessions on both sides. He says, this will improve the lives of Americans. Senator Jerry Moran adds his 2 cents into the mix. Now, the thing is, like, you have a group of people celebrating this as this is something rare. This is something, if you don't take this opportunity now, you're not going to probably see this again in a while. But on the other side, you have the Center for American Progress saying, look, this is not enough. Because if this bill is only passed by itself, like Pelosi is arguing against, you're going to have women actually suffering more, and there's going to be more of a disparity along gender lines. What are your comments on that?
Well, first off, I think it's incredibly rich of Kyrsten Sinema to comment in any way about bipartisanship. But second of all, it's also very strange to talk down on something that supposedly we're supposed to be encouraging. And another thing is that, as Professor Cook pointed out, this is an infrastructure bill. It's supposed to pass. They pass every year. I think it's a very odd thing to try and characterize it as the only way we can ever have something bipartisan, and it's a rare shining, that's a condemnation of the state of our government more so than it is a celebration. And I think the way that some of these not governors, but these lawmakers are responding to it is, it indicates that is more the direction they're going, is that they're pulling further and further away from what they consider a center, and they're trying to say that something like this is rare, and that's not good. That indicates they're not willing to do their jobs.
Yeah, I mean, you look at this.
Sorry.
All I'm going to say is, Mitch McConnell said at the very beginning of the Biden administration, his job was to keep Biden from being successful. So the reason you had this fight for months and months and months is because Mitch McConnell set the tone at the very beginning and said, we're not going to help this guy do anything. Not that we're not going to help the country, not that we're going to replace broken bridges, not that we're going to improve highways, not that we're going to do the things that we've been doing since the Eisenhower administration. We have to do this for the political advantage we can gain by showing that Mr. Biden is inept. And where he ultimately lost it was that Joe Biden was smart enough to go out around the country and talk to governors, talk to mayors, talk to groups of citizens to say, this is what this is. This is not about me taking a victory lap or being a big guy. This is about me helping you. And the Republicans couldn't resist it anymore, which is why at the end of the day, Mitch McConnell had to vote for it. But this is not something, this could have been done in the first month of the Biden administration. But they didn't, because they were trying to figure out a way to shaft Joe Biden, because all they want to do is they only win when Biden loses, according to their mentality.
I would also add, though, I think that this was also the idea of bipartisanship and unity was also something that President Biden ran on when he was campaigning. So I do think that he does see this as a victory, no matter how long it took, because he was saying, listen, we've got to show a way in which we can break the fever in Washington. Even though we know that the fever has not been broken, we know that there are still, just a few months ago, there were people who were wanted to overtake the Capitol and are still trying to disbelieve in the idea of a true functioning democracy. Folks who still don't believe that Joe Biden was the duly elected president. We understand that there's still a lot of commotion happening, but his mission was to show that in some way, he as president can build consensus between his colleagues and whether in the Senate or in the House, and pass something that will do good for the country. And I think for him, he sees this as a victory. Now, I do agree with everyone in saying that, yes, we should be, it's not hard to be able to vote on, paying for better roads, bridges, and highways. We did it when Obama was first in office at a lower scale, but it was something that was passed as well, and it's been passed before. So it's not like it's the biggest victory we've seen or most important one we've seen, but I do think politically, in terms of what Biden's initial mission was professed, he did say that he wanted to show a sign of unity, show that he could help break the fever in Washington, bring people together, forge a new path. I'm not sure if that new path has been fully forged, but he has been able to show some of that in some way. And I do think that that's a win, and that's a score in the win column for him.
So I just want to say I'm sort of fascinated by how important the ability to say bipartisan has become. It is terrific when something is bipartisan, because theoretically that means that both parties can agree that a certain thing is important. But you would never have heard President Lincoln saying that he was just desperate to get a bipartisan bill about whether or not slavery could continue. When the Tennessee Valley Authority was approved and helped bolster the economy and made America great, that created that era that Trump kept espousing as though nothing had caused it just happened. FDR was not concerned, or not mainly concerned at least, with making sure that every single lawmaker was behind it. It was getting what needed to be done. And if we could say that it was done bipartisanly, that was, yay, all of our lawmakers are actually agreeing on something common sense, not, yay, we got all the lawmakers to agree on something, even if we didn't do what needed to be done. We just got a bunch of people on board with it. So just knowing that we have Manchin and Sinema, who are people who would have definitely would have voted against the Tennessee Valley Authority or the Hoover Dam or Eisenhower's interstate program, that are things we need and are the reason the country at any point reached the level of prosperity that the United States had in the 50s and 60s. It blows my mind that, especially in the Democratic Party, or who label themselves Democrats, definitely would have said that's too big a price tag. I don't care if it's going to improve everything and make sure that people can buy food for their table. Right now, I don't think that we can spend $50 million or $1 trillion, even though 5 years down the line, it will generate $60 trillion in national pockets. It just blows me away that no one can. I understand that sometimes people see that number and they balk, but that people who theoretically were highly educated can't see down the road just a few years and be willing to invest in that.
No, you're absolutely right, Mr. Tolan. This idea that bipartisanship, everybody says, these media guys keep saying it, guys and ladies keep saying it all the time, as though it's magical to say bipartisan. And, that's just not true. It's conceptually good, but the idea, the reason you got elected was to get certain things done, fulfill certain promises you made. And as they say, almost wrote, elections have consequences. And if I've got more votes than you do, I get to do what I said I would do. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was not a bipartisan bill. That wasn't the objective. Lyndon Baines Johnson's objective was to get enough votes, however he could get them, from whomever he could get them, to pass the legislation. He didn't care if it was bipartisan. And he famously said, this vote is going to cost the Democratic Party elections for the next 30 years. So he wasn't about kumbaya and bipartisanship. He was about, I got to get this thing passed because it's the right thing to do. And the chips will fall where they may. So this idea, of bipartisanship as being some ideal that we ought to always place above everything else is just lunacy to me. But that's why I teach at Howard's Law School.
So we're at the end, but I do have to. I'll be remiss if we don't talk about this one topic and one question, and that is pertaining to the nearly 7 months that have happened since Biden took office, in which only 10 of Biden's State Department nominees have been confirmed. Dozens more, including some 60 would-be ambassadors, face what one person familiar with the situation called Ted Cruz's death grip. Other senators have put holes on nominees, but none have enforced such a blanket block without an easy path through as Senator Ted Cruz of Texas. The Texan Republican is actually blocking state Democratic nominees en masse because he is upset that Biden waived some sanctions pertaining to a pipeline, specifically the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, a Russian-German energy pipeline project that the United States has long opposed. He has used a mix of procedural moves in the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and on the full chamber floor to delay the confirmation processes and to needle the administration. His actions actually have two impacts. Number one, they either delay the nominees' votes, like when Cruz held over a batch of Biden picks from a Senate Foreign Relations Committee business meeting this past July 28th, to another on August 4th, or they outright block the full Senate from confirming a nominee. Now, my question is, as we're wrapping things up, should Biden go ahead and lift all the sanctions pertaining to this Nord Stream 2 in order to get the bigger picture accomplished, the State Department nominees confirmed? And this is all happening with the backdrop of the Taliban just today capturing its 10th major city near Kabul. And you have a need for the State Department now more than ever. We're already withdrawing from Afghanistan, and the Taliban is continuing to make these conquests in that country. What say you?
Well, I would say I think Senator Cruz is acting very much like a toddler, stomping and screaming and swearing, "I'm going to get my way. I'm going to stop you. We're not leaving the house until I get my cookie," or whatever it is. It's only holding things up. People who are going to be appointed are eventually going to be appointed. People who aren't, wouldn't be. I don't know. For me, the most ridiculous thing is that he claims it has to do with this this pipeline and trying to stop Russian energy supremacy in Europe. But number one, there are better ways of doing that. For instance, endorsing green energy to end Russia's ability to say, well, we've got all the oil. Well, I guess if we're all on solar and wind power, then Russia loses its power to say, we've got all this oil, do what we want, Europe. But also, realistically, it doesn't matter what kind of sanctions the United States puts on that pipeline. It's done. Germany and Russia both want it. Europe wants it. It's happening. When there's no point at all, it's just Cruz trying to do something to get his weird bearded face back on television as being an important player in the country. And even his party doesn't like him. I don't think this is going to win him any more favors with other than that very dedicated group of people who just want to see people or anything Biden stopped. And I honestly don't think that's going to really be able to carry him into office again if that's all he has going for him.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. It's just silly. But again, it's another example of the dysfunctionality of the United States Senate. This sort of arcane principle that you can use senatorial prerogative to put a hold on a nominee has its genesis in something to do with that particular nominee that you needed to get some more conversation, some more discussion about. It's not because you want some other piece of legislation over here passed and you're going to hold up this nominee and you're going to grind the wheels of government to a halt because you want to support Texas oil drilling, because that's really what this is about. It's about oil in Texas being sold to the Germans instead of oil from Russia. It's nuts. But, we allow it and we say, well, this is all part of the Senate and this is why it's the most important deliberative body in the world. And that's just a crock.
And it used to be said, politics stops at the water's edge. But I want to thank each of you for this dynamic and robust discussion. I really and thoroughly enjoyed it. Episode 41 of the Political Mic. Thank you all for making time being here today. With that being said, I'm going to go ahead and conclude the 41st episode of the Political Mic. Thank you all for tuning in.